Good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and how great it is to have as our guest this morning, Mr. Ryan McMaken. Ryan is a housing economist. More important, he's the editor of the Mises Institute's monthly publication, The Free Market, and he's the author of a new book called Commie Cowboys, Bourgeoisie and the Nation State in the Western Genre. A lot of French words in there, Ryan. I don't know, doesn't that make you distraught? You're an historian. Historians are taught, we're all taught, to accept the official view of the past. Don't be a revisionist. Don't try to get a different view in there. So you mean to tell me you're actually saying there's something wrong with this pure American symbol of Americanism, the real Americanism, the Western movie?
Well, I'm saying that especially in that period after World War II, up until about 1965, so that 20-year period, that, yes, the Western primarily serves as a Cold War genre, which helps communicate to us that government is necessary, lots of government violence is necessary, that our elites know best, and that capitalism isn't all necessarily that much of a virtuous pursuit anyway. And as a libertarian writing on this topic, I face an even bigger problem because the reputation of the genre among so many conservatives and libertarians has long been that this is a free market genre and really is pro-individualism. And indeed, even Frank Chodorov has an article that people often cite on how he likes Westerns. And it's a lighthearted and fun article that he wrote, but it's mostly wrong, where he says that Westerns are great because they're filled with individuals who protect themselves and serve themselves and don't need anybody else. But that doesn't seem to be really the issue at all that you get from these post-1945 Westerns, where you need a gunfighter, probably in the form of a sheriff or a cavalryman or maybe a drifter who, though in a more roundabout way, represents the essential skills of government that it can provide. And so we look at all these things and we think, well, maybe the people, as they're shown in these Western films, really don't come off looking all of that good, and they can't really do much without the power of the state.
Well, in fact, aren't the people in the typical Western, thinking of gunfighters, cowering behind their storefronts? I mean, they're all terrified, even though they vastly outnumber the bad guy or the bad guys, and they have to have the marshal or the representative of that figure handle everything for them, and then everything can be okay. Yeah, you're right. As soon as they turn over their money and their authority to this government.
Yeah, there are two ways that the Western mostly is problematic from a libertarian standpoint, and one is the elitism of the genre, and the other is the anti-capitalism. So yeah, let's look at the elitism of it on the conventions in which the townspeople are cowering in the shadows while the skilled gunman saves them all from some foreign threat. And it becomes really explicit in some films. Certainly the most famous example of this is High Noon, where Gary Cooper protects the town from, I think, 3 bad guys who come riding in, and the entire town hides while Marshal Kane has to deal with the problem all by himself. And it's noted, incidentally, that the townspeople who refuse to help him are concerned with property values and the business of the town and these really parochial things like money. Whereas, of course, Marshal Kane is concerned with good things like honor and justice and such. And so, of course, the town then runs away, and he has to help them. And another film that was very similar to High Noon was a movie called The Tin Star, which came out about 5 years later, and was actually the source material of the Tin Star was a motivation for High Noon. But if we look at the Tin Star there's actually a variety of conversations between the Henry Fonda character and the main character discussing how, well, if the sheriff doesn't whip his townspeople into shape, they'll get disorderly and they'll overturn the established order. And so the sheriff needs to bully anyone who pops their head up and tries to take charge out of the mass. So that whole movie is about, if you're a good sheriff, you keep people in line. For the mob is always a lynch mob waiting to happen. Everyone's this racist idiot basically in the town. But fortunately, we have the enlightened sheriff just to show everybody the right way to be doing things.
And not a movie, but both the radio show and the TV show Gunsmoke, which was extremely popular in both versions, always had this view that people are unable to govern themselves. They're either cowards or evil. thank goodness there's the marshal and his assistant who can protect this huge town from the occasional bad guy. So this goes into into television and radio first, and then into television as well.
Oh, sure. And here I look specifically in the book at three directors, the most popular directors who really promoted the big A-type movies. There's a lot of variety in the genre, of course, when you get down to some of the B pictures and the TV and all of that. And some TV shows are worse than others. But The Tin Star, for example, being an Anthony Mann film. And if we look at the works of John Ford's probably our worst violator of libertarian values. Ford, of course, made The Grapes of Wrath, a big, essentially FDR propaganda movie, and during the war made a variety of military propaganda films. And so after the war, Ford takes a turn away from his silent era, makes very permanent movies in general, and it's through him that we get a variety of cavalry movies like Fort Apache, Rio Grande, Stagecoach even, which isn't strictly a cavalry movie. Nevertheless, it's the cavalry that saves everybody in the end from the Indians and makes civilization possible. In fact, there's even a ridiculous scene at the very beginning of She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. There's this prologue where they discuss Custer's loss at the Battle of Bighorn and Battle of Little Bighorn and say, if the 7th Cavalry or if the U.S. sustained another such loss as that, then it would be 100 years before a stagecoach could cross the frontier.
Hey, that would have been great.
Yeah, right. Well, meaning, of course, right, that in 1976 we would be celebrating finally the Transcontinental Railroad. I mean, this assertion that the Indians posed that much of a threat was ludicrous, but really was there to build up the importance of the cavalry to Western civilization. And you get a lot of that in John Ford movies. And so all these lowly people who were settling the frontier, those people are all an afterthought. The important business of the frontier was these cavalrymen, these sheriffs, these marshals, the people who brought civilization. There's no such thing as, of course, spontaneous order on the frontier in these post-war Western films. You always need someone to come and impose it first.
And, of course, if we look at what Tom DiLorenzo has shown us, what Lincoln did during the Civil War, he diverted troops to protect the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, not only, of course, for special interest needs and for serving the power of the government, so that he could send troops quickly to California if it again showed signs of secession. And there were secession sentiments in California, very strong ones at one time. So they were out, but they were killing the Indians. The Indians weren't going after them. They were going out and killing them. The Indians, of course, never posed a threat to the U.S. and its expansion. It's all that's another one of these myths.
Right.
But there always has to be somebody you hate. Maybe it's, the Vietnamese, or it's the Southerners, or it's the Indians, or the Germans, or the Japanese, or, the Iraqis, the Libyans, right? I mean, go down. There's 100. I'm missing 100 various peoples who had to be hated, demonized, and destroyed at various points. But certainly, these movies celebrated the attacks on these people who were not any threat, and mostly just wanted to live their own lives. And of course, breaking treaty after treaty with them. And they would get upset that they'd been moved out of their original home, put in someplace else, and then the U.S. forces wanted to take over their new home. And for some strange reason, they didn't like that.
Well, that's a common theme, of course, in the Westerns is people who are doing business with the Indians or helping out with the Indians are the worst guys. And a common thing is that bad guys in Westerns sell guns to Indians. This crops up again and again. It's the same thing now. You would have a modern movie, someone trying to sell a suitcase nuke to a terrorist, right? It's the exact same thing. And this was a big deal in, say, The Man from Laramie, pretty entertaining Anthony Mann film with James Stewart, in which, yes, the bad guy not only is he selling guns, repeating rifles, even worse, to the Indians, but he's a businessman who has a ranch, and he lets the Indians graze on his land and so on. So the whole thing's sinister. The business guy is sinister. And he wants to, of course, make money by selling guns to the Indians. That's even worse. In the end, it's also implied that by selling guns to the Indians, there will be a general uprising and the Indians will murder all the white people within 3 days' ride. And so it has this whole, it's not enough that the bad guys are bad. I mean, they're actually trying to end life as we know it on the frontier. And that's hardly just this one movie. You find that again and again. And that's also a function of the cavalry in a lot of these movies, is preventing free trade between whites and Indians. And so, yeah, market activity very bad from this standpoint, for sure.
Ryan, isn't this just Hollywood in general? I mean, isn't Hollywood an anti-business operation? I remember Mises pointing this out, that it seemed to him like in every movie he got dragged to see, the businessman was the villain. Although I noticed there's never a villainous movie maker in any of these films, but every other kind of business is evil. But is the Western just typical of this aspect of Hollywood, or was it because of its appeal to Americans, to the American soul or whatever? Do they have even a worse effect than, say, detective movies where a businessman is always the villain?
Well, Paul Cantor will note that there are some secret libertarians these days, at least, in Hollywood, and there is some diversity now.
Sure.
I would submit that there was much less diversity, actually, back then, though, in the heyday of these Westerns, because, of course, in 1945, who's the audience? It's the people who loved the New Deal, who view the U.S. government as perhaps the most heroic organization on earth at that time. And so it wasn't much of a leap then to show the villainy of private sector people in these films. And that's the other aspect of it. I mean, it's not just spotty here and there that we see a capitalist as the bad guys in these Western films. We see it again and again. In almost every film, you can almost set your clock to it. The bad guy is a rancher, a big landowner, a big farmer, somebody of that sort, and you need a sheriff or a marshal to come in and set those people straight. Or on a more subtle level, the bad guys are these craven, cowardly business people who don't understand the way of the gun, which is presumably far more virtuous. Just a good example of big guys versus the little guys is Red River by Howard Hawks, where the John Wayne character, Tom Dunson, decides he's going to go out to Texas and start a ranch. And so he does, and he finds the land he wants. Well, it turns out the land is already owned by a Mexican Don. But as is explained to the viewer, the Mexican Don owns too much land. Apparently, there's some cutoff point where if you own too much land, you're a bad guy. Dunson then just kills the writer who comes in from the Don's headquarters and then just squats on the land and takes it, and apparently takes a small enough amount of land that he's a good guy, and then proceeds to build his ranch. And then later, when he's doing the cattle drive, murders any employee who wishes to leave his employment during the drive. And by the end, we're supposed to believe that this is a great story about capitalism because this guy built up a ranch. But I guess if you built your ranch by murdering the previous owner and then murdering your own employees, that this is the best Hollywood can come up with for a great pro-capitalism movie. And you see just that theme again and again.
Thanks to everybody who shops at Amazon.com. I wanted to mention that LRC gets a small commission at no cost to the buyer every time you go to Amazon through an LRC link, any of the widgets on the page for books or other items, or entering through the ad at the top left-hand corner of the front page. So thanks again, and it's a huge help. And Amazon, what a great company. It's just extraordinary. You don't need to go down to the local bricks and mortar place. You don't have to pay, in many cases anyway, sales taxes. So far as I can tell, virtually everything the human race produces is for sale at Amazon.com. So I highly recommend it. It helps keep LRC alive and growing. So thanks to all of you who shop at Amazon. Ryan, John Wayne, of course, was a terrible warmonger, but he also has the reputation, maybe like a typical conservative, and maybe it's a false reputation, of being free market. I mean, any indication that he had any qualms about any of these movies that he might have made for the Ford ones or other Westerns?
Oh, yeah, I can't recall ever reading anything where he, of course, approached the economic side of things at all. I mean, I'm sure, like most conservatives, he said a good game about individualism and being personally responsible for yourself and not being on welfare and that sort of thing. But when it came down to the complexities of the markets and how capitalism works and so on, the movies he was in mostly, there are a few exceptions like Chisholm, where the big rancher is actually a good guy, but we could just go through these movies such as The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, where the big ranchers in that movie are horrible. They employ Liberty Valance to attack people and beat people up. They don't want the territory to become a state because this presumably would be bad for their power. And so big ranchers are bad there. Of course, another classic example is Shane, which doesn't have John Wayne in it, but a lot of people love that movie. See it as the best Western ever. But of course, the bad guy there is a big rancher who tries to throw a bunch of farmers off his land who are there squatting. Now, a lot of people who defend the Western will say, well, really, in all of these cases, the bad guy is really, he's living off federal subsidies because he's an open ranger. And so he's an open range rancher, and then these homesteaders come in and they want to take over the land. And so really they're the small owners or private property types, and the big open range guy is really, he's really getting government favor, so that's why he's bad. Well, I mean, yeah, I'm sure that was true historically. In fact, we know it was true historically, but that stuff is never explained in these old 50s Westerns.
No.
So, I mean, a 13-year-old who goes in and watches the movie, what does he see? He sees there's a big guy who owns a lot of land, and he's bad, and then the little farmers are good. So people, big landowners, people who own big operations like factory owners, capitalists, and so on, they're bad guys. And only really in later Westerns of the 70s, 80s, and 90s do we see them really approach the issue of these people are living off government subsidies. For example, in the very first episode of Hell on Wheels, which is about the Intercontinental Railroad, it's very clear that it's all about a complex relationship between the railroad contractors and the U.S. government, and it's all about trying to get as many tax dollars as you can for your railroad. You never saw a conversation like that in those old classic Westerns where the stories are far more simplistic, and it's really about small guys who are virtuous versus big capitalists who are evil. Complexity just simply does not exist as much as some pro-capitalist lovers of the Western may want it to.
Well, Ryan, if somebody is pro-capitalist and likes Westerns too, you mentioned Chisholm. Give us some other examples of movies that you like.
Well, there are some great movies that actually depart from the general formula. One is The Magnificent Seven, which
I love that
very
movie.
unlike. Yeah, it's a great movie because in that townspeople, unlike most Westerns, take charge of their own destiny. They go out and they hire the gunfighters, and the gunfighters work for the town. There's a business relationship then, and then even at the end, the townspeople actually rise up and pick up furniture and axes and such and kill their oppressors. It's amazing how rarely you see this in a Western where the townspeople actually organize themselves. Usually they just rely on an expert from the government to do it for them. So The Magnificent Seven is very good there. And there's also a little-known movie called The Ballad of Cable Hogue. This is a Sam Peckinpah movie. It's a 1970 movie. And it's about a man named Cable Hogue who's wandering through the desert, or rather his friends abandon him, steal all his stuff, and he's about to die in the desert, but he discovers then a water hole. He discovers a spring in the desert. And the whole movie is about how Cable builds up a situation around this watering hole and gets rich, essentially homesteading these 3 acres in the desert where he provides water and food and a bed and breakfast, essentially, for people. It's a great homage to entrepreneurship and a variety of other good libertarian values. Almost nobody ever talks about it because it's by need in unconventional Western. He's pretty nonviolent. He's interested primarily in making money. And then at the end of his eulogy, his friends talk about how ruthless he was and all that, but they mean that in a good way, that being a savvy businessman was particularly virtuous to them. And so that's a very different kind of movie. And then, of course, Unforgiven has a lot to say to a libertarian on the topic of violence, on the problem of the abuse of power by sheriffs and so on. And in particular, the issue of gun control comes up in Unforgiven. It's notable that in Winchester 73, an old traditional Western, the main character, when he rides into town, has to give up guns to the sheriff, Wyatt Earp. And this is all seen as very friendly, of course we'll give up our guns because the sheriff says so. And then it's quite clear in the film that the town is a safe place because of the gun control. Whereas in Unforgiven, Little Bill disarms people who come to town with guns, specifically English Bob, and then he beats up English Bob savagely on screen, takes his gun. So it's clear that gun control has a slightly different flavor in a new, later revisionist Western than in one of the old traditional ones, gun control is primarily a way for the sheriff to abuse the population. And that movie just in general simply shows that the whole myth of the gunfighter is nonsense, that really it's about outsmarting your opponent and shooting him any way you can. That old honor code and all that was never true in the West, and that maybe the West would have been a better place without all the sheriffs and gunfighters running around. And so, as a libertarian, I, of course, prefer the later Westerns, the works of Sergio Leone, some of the Sam Peckinpah, where agents of law enforcement are usually bad guys. And so I think the Westerns actually moved in a very positive direction over the last 30 years, as opposed to those older Westerns of the post-war period, which were supposedly supposed to look to as great symbols of American individualism. But I really don't think that that's really there if you really watch those movies critically.
Ryan, any Clint Eastwood movies you like? What about the Outlaw Josie Wales, for example?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a fantastic movie, right? From every angle. He's a former rebel. He moves out west and befriends a settler family, and there's kind of this Waco-ish scene at the end where Josie and the settler family find this house, and they have to defend themselves from an onslaught of federal officers. And then at the very end, Josie even makes peace with the Indians. So yeah, that's one of those very nice 1970s type westerns to try overturning from that period. Of course, another good example with Clint, although he didn't direct it, I think, is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which has a nice anti-war theme where the good guys are people who wander around searching for treasure, minding their own business. This whole movie, though, is against the backdrop of the American Civil War in the New Mexico, which few people know about, but it was around here in Colorado, the New Mexico theater of the war is fairly important. The war is portrayed as brutal and inhuman. The only government officer with any scruples at all basically has to stay drunk all the time in order to deal with the absurdity of the war and the insanity of it all. You look at that and you walk away with a totally different image than you would have found in one of these traditional Westerns, where, by the way, the John Ford Westerns would always deal with the issues of the South by placing one Southern soldier within this Northern cavalry unit, and then he usually dies at some point during the film. And then on the soundtrack, there's a few bars of Dixie played, while the Union soldiers say, "Well, in the end, right, we were all united, and he killed for the U.S. government, and that's all that matters, really. But he died," and so on. So there's always this theme of unity in those movies. The exception being The Searchers, of course, where the quasi-good guy, Ethan, is a former, and he's an unreconstructed Southern soldier. But for the most part, Ford goes out of his way to show that, yes, after the Civil War, we were all united again, and everything was good, and we came together to against the real enemy, which was the Indians, and this occurs outside of Ford's movies too. But of course, Eastwood overturns all of that with The Outlaw Josie Wales and with some themes in other films that he was in and associated with as well. The 1970s, of course, dispenses with the whole Indians as all of bad guys narrative and starts to question really the power of the federal government. Not surprising, these are the days of Watergate and Vietnam and so. And of course, I think that was a positive development, and it's turned heartily unpatriotic, as many conservatives now speak about those 1970s Westerns.
Ryan, as you pointed out, too, there's some very interesting stuff going on television, HBO, and other sort of Western miniseries that seem to be a big improvement on the original Westerns, too, or the post-war Westerns.
Right. Well, part of the reason I was motivated to come back and extend this article that turned into this book was Paul Cantor came out with a lengthy essay on Deadwood, the HBO series. He looks at that in some detail and really looks at it as a conflict between the Hobbesian worldview and the Lockean worldview. Lockean, of course, being, yes, there's spontaneous order that arises out of economic activity. The Hobbesian view, of course, being that, well, we need a gunman to impose order before anybody can do anything. He notes that Deadwood takes a very good Lockean view, and that the people of Deadwood are primarily concerned with making money. The pursuit of money, in fact, civilizes everyone, that it prevents people from engaging in violence, that while it's messy, hardly easy to tell who's good and who's bad, and that, sure, some people get killed, it's like in real life, where there are a lot of different interests, competing factions, and that it's the business people of the town, in the case of Deadwood, Al Swearingen, the foul-mouthed brothel owner, who's kind of the hero of the series as the series moves forward. And he's the one who calls together the town people to prevent the town from destroying itself. And that the enemy in that series, by the way, are people from the federal government. And true to form, there is a huge businessman who comes in and threatens the town. But in the end, it's clear that really he's not so much a businessman, a politician who wants to crush local business owners. And Deadwood's filled with good, positive themes. It's explicitly libertarian in a variety of places where the government is portrayed as evil and really there just to destroy the dreams of the people who had moved out west to find freedom. And then, of course, Hell on Wheels as well is pretty good, and that's a current series. They're going to do season 3 soon here, I think. In that, they have a bit of fun with it. The bad guys, well, the hero, first of all, sort of a hero, is a former Confederate soldier whose family was murdered by Union officers. So he's on the lookout for these Union people who murdered his family. But in the meantime, he has to work for the railroad. And the most evil character is a guy called the Swede, who's actually Norwegian, apparently, who is the enforcer for the town, and he enjoys enforcing the law and making people's lives miserable and extorting them. In this series, the official arm of law enforcement is a really bad guy and the worst guy, and the good people, though, are the prostitutes and these Irish businessmen who want to make some money, and former slaves as well, who are trying to do a lot of work to better themselves. So it's a nice complex milieu of characters, totally different from what you would have found in 1950, where the social structure is complex, where the state is evil, where almost everybody has been wronged by the government at some point, whether it's the Southerner or the slave or the new immigrant, and this makes for good TV.
Well, Ryan McMaken, thank you so much for this book. I want to highly recommend it. Commie Cowboys, the Bourgeoisie and the Nation State in the Western Genre, and has a foreword by Paul Cantor. So thanks for writing that. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much.
Good to talk to you. Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the upper right-hand corner of the LRC front page. Thank you.